Welcome, folks, to another day in the Geek Live. Today on D&D Fridays, we'll be talking about a little something that can be very fun or very detrimental. It's called the boss battles. Without further ado, let's see what we can do.
Get going.
So, when we talk about boss battles, what are we primarily talking about? Usually, some big bad guy that it's either the end of the campaign or a piece of the campaign or what have you. Typically, tends to be a little bit more powerful than your everyday enemies that you're used to fighting. Um, they typically have more HP, legendary actions, legendary resistances, more features or multi attack or what have you. Um, and they're typically designed to be more challenging, um, and if done correctly, usually as players you should probably make sure your strategy is on point to some degree.
Definitely.
And and the way I look at it, there's two main groups of boss battles. The single boss battle where there's only just one person that you're fighting, and the boss battle with minions where there's one person that you can clearly tell is the boss, and he she, or it is definitely has some minions, whether it's two lieutenants or a bunch of foot soldiers or whatever it may be, and both have their merits. Um, and with that, let's take a deep dive into each one and see what operates under them.
Sure.
So when it comes to the single boss battle, typically have one person that you're fighting, and and they're usually coming after folks using whatever subset of skills that they have. One of the biggest things as a GM that you gotta remember when operating a single boss battle, though, is action economy. Typically, players will have a much better action economy as if you have five players, that's five total actions and five total bonus actions and five total reactions that they're taking. Whereas the single boss battle, that person only has one action, one reaction, one bonus action. Unless, of course, you have some features to say otherwise. Like,
Right.
for instance, especially later on in the campaign, you should probably think about giving legendary resistances, legendary actions, maybe some homebrew um, features, things like that to just balance it out.
Yep. Yep. Everybody's favorite discovery when battling a boss is that they've got some sort of legendary resistance or legendary action, and you're totally taken by surprise. It's always the best thing to do when you just best thing that can happen when you discover that stuff.
And when it comes to legendary resistances, what's your thoughts on the GM saying, okay, this dude's just succeeded on the saving throw, and that's one legendary resistance down, as opposed to, yeah, this guy made a save, and not mention it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, Nakai. I think when it comes to battling a boss that has some sort of legendary resistance, you have to give the players a little bit of leeway there and let them know that those are being spent. Maybe maybe there's a fine balance there in letting them know the first time, and then depending on how many there are, you don't tell them the next time or the third time. But then you throw another one in there maybe when they're all gone, so that it's still kind of they're knowing that they know that they're whittling them down, and to keep on that vector until they realize that they're all gone. But I also see that there's a little bit of merit there with not giving out that information. Um, I guess from my perspective, I guess from my perspective, I think I'd rather be on the side of more information than not when it comes to a boss battle, because you never know how much of a bullet sponge a boss is going to be, and you don't want to waste. You don't want to be super unfair and have the players waste five, six, seven, rounds of combat, not doing thinking they're doing a ton of damage and not doing anything.
Mhm.
I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some good merit to that. Like, definitely at least to some degree, say, hey, some type of resources is being spent on the boss to get out of this. Maybe not
Right.
necessarily saying, all right, legendary resistance 1 out of 3 is used, but maybe to some degree, at least once or twice or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And same thing with legendary actions. I think with that, I feel like there's a little bit more leeway in terms of not particularly saying how much legendary actions this perspective thing cost, and just say, all right, at the end of your turn, boss A decides to take a legendary action to do X, Y, and Z.
Right. I agree with you that I think I think there's a lot more leeway with the legendary actions, right? You kind of want to randomize when they're used, how they're used, and not necessarily spam them all if they haven't used them right before their turn starts again, right? So I think they're a lot more situational in that, and you can use it to form and mold the battle and have it feel like it's more of this ebb and flow with the legendary actions.
Yeah. And with reactions, legendary actions, I mean, you typically have 3 uses of it, rules as written, but in some cases, I could definitely understand maybe giving a fourth or fifth one to a boss. Just depending on like what your players can do, how many players you have. Like, if you're running a game with 7 people, let's say, you probably would want to give an extra 1 or 2 legendary actions to that creature just to help with the action economy. Yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah. And when it comes to boss battles, you you typically think of these big legendary and popular enemies like beholders and liches, Draco liches, stuff like that. But they could be as simple as pretty simple as something homebrew that you created just for that campaign. And I think for especially in those lesser known boss battles and the homebrew stuff, it should definitely be made known. All right, this is a boss battle, so expect things to be tougher, so that your players actually take it seriously.
Yeah, I think there's a situation where you want to let your players know that this is a boss battle. I also think narratively that sometimes it's good to have that element of surprise in there when the boss battle is going to occur. Um, you know, a scenario just off the top of my head is if you're in a dungeon and you're trying to rescue people or whatever, and unbeknownst to you, the boss is there's the mini boss or the boss of the campaign is in that same dungeon, and you don't realize it and they don't realize you're there, and all of a sudden you open up a door and boom, there's the boss. I think that helps from a narrative perspective, and I also think that it helps it helps the players kind of start figuring out how to judge when they should retreat versus stand their ground and try and take the boss down, because there is always there sometimes um, retreating is the better part of valor, right? You don't want to do a total party TKO too early on, but maybe introducing that boss, a smaller boss battle or something like that is also useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and introducing the, if done right, introducing like the BBG of the campaign early on could be a interesting thing to do from a narrative standpoint.
Absolutely.
Because sometimes that would allow the players to see, oh, this is the BBEG that we're probably going to have to fight much later on in the campaign. We know where this is going now a little bit.
Right. Gives them a little bit of that direction to be able to move the story and the campaign forward.
Yeah, and then
So one comment I wanted to make before we keep going on here, back to the single boss versus boss with minions uh, topic here, just a little bit. I'd like to see what you think about my thoughts here are a little bit more on what is the difference between the two. So for me, like a single boss is something that is like a monster, something where it's out in the wild or in some deep hole or some deep dungeon that's old and decrepit, and it's just by itself, right? It has no, it's wild. There's no intelligence, no wisdom. There's probably some exceptions to that, right? Like you probably only want to have a dragon be a single boss. You don't necessarily want minions with that, but in general, I would see, in my opinion, a single boss is sort of in that monster category, whereas a boss with minions is somebody that's got a lot more intelligence about them, or very manipulative and manipulative is the word I wanted, but um, they they're very strategic in the things and the decisions that they make, and they surround themselves with their minions, right? What do you
mm-hmm.
think about that, Nakai?
um, I can definitely understand that. I think there's a lot of good merits to that. Um, I think in addition to that, I could also see maybe sometimes, depending on the story, maybe you make like the end of a dungeon boss a single boss, depending on how you deal with it. Like that, I think that could be also a possibility. Kind of like maybe you clear out this dungeon, go through all the puzzles and whatnot, and now you encounter the master of that dungeon or whatever you call that person.
Sure.
Or it's like maybe like the BBG says, all right, I got my right hand man here. I'm confident in his abilities. Go ahead and take care of these people, and maybe that right hand man is maybe like a little, might be smart, but maybe he's a little arrogant and think, yeah, I don't need minions. I can take them on myself. I got all these plans with my spells or whatever. But I think overall that whole wild monster type of thing works quite well.
Okay. Good.
And and on the flip side of the coin, when we go to boss battles with minions, you typically see that as maybe like the BBG or something like that. Um, Typically, a boss with minions is a little bit more difficult than just a single boss battle. For me, that's mainly because with a single boss battle, you only have one person to worry about that's firing off attacks at you. With minions, you might have upwards of like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 plus different directions that you're being fired upon. So you have to really think about how are we going to deal with this? Who are we going to focus fire first? How can we crowd control whatever it may be? Which another point of boss battles with minions, make sure you focus fire some stuff first. Because a creature with 1 HP is still just as dangerous as a creature with 100 HP or 200 HP.
You gotta whittle down the field. Focus, remove, move to the next. Focus, remove, move to the next. Right?
Yeah. So it's always best to go after like one or two creatures.
For sure.
Yeah. And just to put that into D&D terms, minions help solve that action economy problem of a single boss.
They do.
But, so, what's your thoughts on the boss battle with minions? Do you usually prefer boss battles with minions or single boss battles, or does it
I don't.
change depending on the part of the campaign?
Yeah, I don't think I necessarily have a preference on one or the other. I think as long as it makes sense in the situation, I'm good with either one. I think the only problem I would have is if the if you include minions with a boss battle and you make the minions essentially as strong as the boss, and they're there just to, essentially just overpowering everything, then that might be a little bit frustrating and definitely unfun. But I don't think I necessarily have a preference. I enjoy both types of combat when I'm playing a character. So
Okay. Yeah, that's a good little piece of tidbit there. It's like no matter what type of boss battle you're going for, as long as it makes sense in the narrative or the location and whatnot. Like
right,
like putting a giant fire dragon in an underwater temple is probably not a good location wise thing for it.
right. That probably doesn't make much sense in any fashion doing that.
Now maybe a steam dragon that's causing the surrounding ocean to boil up, causing a certain instance of localized global warming, and now you have to solve that issue of people actually losing their way of life. All right, now that makes sense for a steam dragon.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's situations, right? I don't. I think what we're kind of talking about here are generalized rules and suggestions, right? But if it makes sense to put a fire dragon in a water temple for whatever reason, then people should do that, right? But I think in general, you want to make sure that it makes sense.
Yep. And then I think there's one little bit of a third instance of a boss battle, and to me that's what I like to call the final boss battle of a campaign. That's typically, especially in some sort of like heroic campaign type of thing, you typically have this big bad evil dude who's typically pretty strong, and he's commanding all of these enemies that you've been facing off against throughout the entire campaign. And this final boss battle could go either way in terms of have minions or not have minions. But I think the one thing that kind of sort of sets it apart is, at least to me, is it should be the toughest combat of the campaign. As if you think about it, that's when your players should be at their best of the campaign. All the
Yeah.
magic items, all the features, all that stuff. So it's like definitely make it the toughest you can without being a intentional TPK type of thing.
Yep. I agree with that. When it's the end boss of the campaign, you definitely no holds barred
Yep.
for sure. What about? So I got a question for you, and I know this one is gonna this one hits home for you. What are your thoughts on multi-stage bosses?
You are so correct. That does hit home for me. I I definitely enjoy having a multi-stage boss. I mean, I think it's one of those things that is definitely good to have sometimes. Maybe not every single boss, but I think it's something good to have. And it definitely fits with at least the final boss fight too. Have
Sure.
that multi-stage. It's like, all right, once the players reduce the boss by, let's say, 20%, the boss like transforms or gain access to their sixth through ninth level spell slots or whatnot. So I think it's, to me, a multi-stage boss keeps the players on their toes, because now the players know, all right, this is a multi-stage boss. What is this dude going to do next stage? What do we have to watch out for? And when is that stage going to come? We're not
Right.
sure. So now we have to. So now players have to gauge their resources a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely keeps. I definitely agree that it keeps the players on their toes and it makes the combat more interesting. I definitely think, like you mentioned, it's probably not something that you always want to do, right? Um, Too much of a good thing, as they say, uh, isn't always, isn't the way you want to go about it. So you want to make those types of bosses feel special and have them again in the right situation. But I definitely think that it definitely spices up the combat and gives for definitely a different experience.
Yep. And and definitely challenge players with boss fights, because they're supposed to be boss fights. Shouldn't technically be pushovers unless in the spur of the moment players come up with this cool combo that you're like, oh shoot, I did not know about that combo beforehand, type of thing. But also at the same time, as a GM, especially with boss battles, you shouldn't intentionally try to TPK your opponent or players. Granted, final boss battle you want to make it as tough as possible, but always ensure that it's not so tough that it's impossible for players to defeat them, as then
Right.
it kind of loses that glimmer of hope type of thing.
Absolutely.
So it's like, at, as deadly as the prismatic wall and reverse gravity combination might be, definitely err on the side of caution when using stuff like that, as that could quite easily kill a few players if they happen to fail their save.
Yep. Definitely. That is very true.
Mm.
That is very true.
Although when you have 19th and 20th level players, you can kind of be a little bit more comfortable with some of those spell combinations and the like, but still be careful with your intentions of a difficult boss battle.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree with that. Oops.
And I think the final boss battle, if nothing else, should be at the very least one boss battle that as a GM you should give a heads up to your players in terms of, all right, we're having the final boss battle in like a session or two. Make sure you're ready.
Oh yeah,
whereas
definitely.
whereas every other boss battle, you could do that, or you could just throw it into the wind like we talked about earlier. But
Yep.
yeah, as we said, final boss battle should be the most difficult battle of the entire thing. And and as you go through the campaign, I believe that as a GM, you should really be studying your players, seeing what they can and can't handle, so you can tweak your boss battles as you go along. Just so you can say, all right, these boss battles, they may be difficult, but at least they're going to be fair to what my players can and can't do.
Yeah, I think that's probably in my opinion, I think that's probably the best the most important piece of advice is make sure that they are fair, right? Not too easy, not too difficult, enough to make sure that there's tension and people have can have fun at the same time. Um, So making sure that fair is a great way to sum that up.
Yep. And any other types of boss battles that comes to mind?
No, I cannot think of any more.
Well, with that, we'll close on out, and just remember, boss battles are great. Use boss battles always. Well, not every session always, but remember, be balanced and be methodical in what you do and how you do and how you run boss battles. And before we head out for the night, make sure y'all hit the subscribe button, notification button, comment down below, all of that 9 yards. And until next time, keep your life geeky.
Bye, guys.